inability of our system to deliver justice as it should be delivered in a formal sense. I did not, I haven't been part of yesterday's deliberations, and I've been given to understand that we are to talk about the problems in the system. I don't know if that is what you really want to talk about, and this is going to be very anecdotal and more a conversation. I would much rather, ma'am, if you would permit, that we had question and answer, which all of us could take, rather than rather a discussion for the whole, rather than me, babbling on, because I haven't really prepared for this in any formal sort of way. The kind of thing that we work on, which you must have heard my colleagues talk about yesterday, is the police. And what we look at really is, let me tell you where we're coming from first of all. What we look at essentially is police accountability. And while we began looking at police accountability as if it was something that we could disassociate from the whole system, then we found that the system itself is designed to be unaccountable. It is designed in a way that is long gone, where it's as if we're thinking about what is this lovely round thing, shall we call it a wheel, but we are in the 21st century. It's just like that. We have continued unquestioningly to have a system of policing which is, I think, was not even suited for when it was created. And if it was suited for that time, it is long gone. And we don't want to admit this. At least that is not the conversation. I beg your pardon. I'm just going to put my phone on. I'm so sorry. That is not the conversation that we are even beginning to have. What we are having just now, at the moment in India as a whole, is great resistance to the idea of improving policing. So that hits against directly how your criminal justice system works and how your trial even begins, because there are assumptions of rule of law which will not stand scrutiny. That is the big problem. The conversation just now is, we are all right. This is the conversation from within the police. We are all right. We just need to do a few adjustments and we will get to a better place. And a better place, what the degrees of that better place are, is being enunciated by those people who have power within the system. It is not being enunciated with the public at large. It's not being enunciated with the context at large. Yes, there are certain things where there is a flare-up, let us say terrorism, or let us say a certain violent act which indicates how badly off women or how vulnerable women can be. In that case, there's a moment, and in that moment there's what we like to call introspection. Who is doing the introspection, what the conversation is about, what the power structures are about, where the dominant voices are coming from, we don't know. We haven't analyzed sufficiently. And then, for instance, in the case of that ghastly rape, which I'm sure you've all heard of, there was an instant reaction because there could have been no resistance to it. It was so bad. So there was a committee formed, and there was immediately the stakeholders were identified as being women, rather than being the justice system, rather than being so many of the other things that could have been looked at. For instance, how do you control a crowd, which has a lot of justification on its side, a lot of anger on its side. What do you do about that? How do you repair those things? How do you deal with those things? So it all came down to focusing on what should we do to make women safer. But the conversation then quickly turned to, it turned to what kind of laws shall we have that would make matters simpler for women to get so-called justice. So what we tend to do in those cases is to give in to a pressure group. I'm not saying that women as a pressure group, myself included, did not have a justifiable issue to talk about. But it was an issue in the round, much larger issue than merely making a law. And then the need to show that there is something, a reaction that is very giving, open, accommodative, creates laws that we are then not able to implement. This opens up a whole area of research about actually what is taking place when we create a law that then creates, again, the law seems to be leaping ahead in its conceptual ideology of privileging a certain group of people who have been wronged without looking at the damage it is doing to the fabric of the law as such. Law and justice as for everybody. The police anecdotally are telling me that they love this law, this new law, because it allows them a huge amount of negotiation capability to settle scores, to arrange things, to be adjudicators, and they've taken on a whole new role in adjudicating cases which will then never come to court. I could go into all of this at length, but I honestly don't want to. I just want to set this out there as areas of concern and worry. Even without this particular example that I gave you, the ordinary course of law, and as I began to talk to you about police, if the gateway is so badly manned, if the gateway is so discretionary, if the gateway is so uncontrolled by capable gatekeepers, honestly, where do you start? As I began to tell you, we began by looking at police accountability as if we could segment it. Then we couldn't segment it, and then we went into looking at the whole systemic reform of the police. And the dilemma that we are faced with as an organization is, do we go along with the conversation of incremental changes where there can be incremental changes? Or do we go along with, do we start a new conversation and push a new conversation that is completely radical? For instance, the new state of Telangana has been born recently. And I have been hoping to have a conversation with the Chief Minister. And I wanted to tell him, and this is the dilemma that I would love to put before you. I don't know whether it's an academic dilemma or one that is suited to criminologists. But I just wanted to tell him, listen, why don't you just scrap the police? Just be courageous. Just scrap the police and start it again. Start it again and start a trend. You've got a small state, you've got an interesting state, you've got a new beginning. There are examples of this all over the place. And it will so shake up the system that every other system that is connected to it, like your criminal justice system, like your prosecutorial system, your defense system, the magistracy, all of them will have to, you will break this so cozy relationship between all these people who are doing things and making incremental changes to suit them, rather than to suit the client of the system or the victim of the system or the witness within the system. Then I was wondering, maybe I should take advice from all of you. then I was wondering, would he even listen? Or would he throw me out? Or would he think I was a crazy lady who's come from somewhere else and shout and say, never mind? Or would I have planted a seed? Because if we do it incrementally in Telangana, we're just going to end up with the same system. We have seen it in Chhattisgarh, we have seen it in Uttarakhand. In fact, these new states that have started have actually deteriorated in terms of what they can possibly do for many, many structural reasons. And those structural reasons are the base on which we are trying to now create a new policing for a 21st century. It's not going to happen. I always tell this story. I was reading a report which I discovered newly, which talked about torture. And I was reading it, and the English seemed rather good, but it just seemed a little bit anachronistic. But I kept on reading it, and I thought, this is really true. I wonder who wrote this report. And then I went back to looking at the front page, and it turned out to be the torture report of 1903. And it was just the same as it could be today, but much worse, perhaps. Today, much worse. With less honesty in the reporting. So, there we are. I don't know where to start, and I'm happy to take questions. I've told you the problem. The solutions at the moment in my hand, and I can only talk of what is in my hand, is that the conversation has gone from total silence. I'm talking about a span of 15 years. It has gone from total silence and resistance and incomprehension to a great many people, both within the police, not yet within the political forces, not yet, I would say, within the bureaucracy, which is starting to talk about we can't go on like this. Because somewhere, the problem itself, the problems of the client group itself, have somewhere now matched with the self-interest of the establishment. And it's only for that reason. I'm very cynical about this. I don't think people are doing it out of any altruistic or visionary sense. It's just that for the moment, the self-interest matches, and so we must change the police a little bit.
Thank you very much. I think you've just demonstrated that you don't need to come with a pile of papers to make a very good presentation at an academic conference.
Thank you.
What you've nicely done, despite not being here yesterday, is actually drawn on many of the themes and the topics. Sorry. You're right. You have drawn on many of the themes and the topics.
One of our finest presentations.
Well, excellent. I entirely agree with you. Issues of accountability were certainly discussed yesterday. Certainly power imbalances was a common theme throughout the day. Lack of power of whole sections of the population. And being appreciative of the context within which criminal justice plays out. That came out, I think, to a lesser or greater extent in all of our papers yesterday. And of course, the issue of vulnerable women, again, came in some of the papers yesterday and will come in certainly Dr. Condry's paper later today. And some of the issues you raised then resonated for me greatly with those. And will come again in a second presentation this morning. I was also pleased you spoke about the rape case, because when I saw that playing out in the media in the UK, my initial response was possibly similar to yours, which was indeed enormous sympathy for the women in the case, enormous sympathy for the women involved in the demonstrations, but also I was terrified that a country that uses the death penalty so little and has managed to some extent to reserve it for the rarest of the rare would now be pushed towards a much greater use of the death penalty in these cases. And these cases are horrific and they do need a response, but they don't necessarily need the knee-jerk reaction of yet more and yet tougher criminal justice. So from a sort of abolitionist perspective, I was deeply concerned about the demonstrations after that case. So having just preambled that slightly, the other thing was that I think the interesting thing is the unintended consequences of legal reform, the things that we don't yet anticipate when we think we're doing the right thing by pressing forward. So, holding aside the fact that sometimes laws are brought in a very cynical way, and sometimes reforms brought in a very simple way to further the interests of the powerful, as you very nicely put it at the beginning. There are also often these unintended consequences, and watching how they play out is a very sobering reminder of meddling without the best intent. So I've already said way too much, and I do want to open the floor before, if you don't mind, before we move on to our next presentation, to give people a chance to just respond to some of the points that Maya made, or to ask her further questions. She obviously has a wealth of knowledge and experience behind her. Yes, Ben?
Well, I've got a lot of sympathy with the idea of scrapping it and starting again in these concepts. That's not something we've been able to consider doing in the UK, and perhaps we should. Where would you put dealing with corruption and on that, comparing that with scrapping it, starting it again, and an incremental change? I mean, is the corruption problem so big that it falls into the start this again, or could it conceivably at least be dealt with incrementally?
I think in my Let's Start Again dialogue, I have completely assumed that corruption won't play a part. But of course, if corruption then did play a huge part, why bother to start again? And I think you're right, I am naive to think that corruption would not play. But you can put in systems. For instance, there have been experiments with transparent recruiting that have made a difference. But you probably, if people came in through a recruiting process of the constabulary without paying money to begin with, and to some extent, I mean, that's not the only thing. I'm just giving you the example of recruitment. You can computerize it, and then you come up on a computer, and then there's very little discretion involved. But then if your computer and your exercises still are looking at the size of your chest and how tall you are rather than your psychological makeup, then you only get a certain amount of correctiveness. So you have to put in a whole system. You have to really think it out before you scrap what there is. You have to really think it out about how the sort of principles of transparency you're going to put in, principles of participation, checks and balances. And do we have really the energy and the mental energy and the spiritual energy to do that? Yet, you have to be a hugely confident leader to do that. A leader, and I shouldn't be giving examples like this, but I will. A leader like Mr. Modi, who seems to be tough and strong and everything at the moment for everybody, I think could have done it in Gujarat. But whether he can now orchestrate something as complex as changing the criminal justice system or the justice system at large and supervise it and control the outcomes of it, doubtful. It's a state subject, but had he had that mindset, perhaps someone who has that kind of charisma and first years of support and really had a vision of the detailing, and a team could do it.
Just go back, the thing that springs to mind that the model for this might be some things that goes on in the United States, where they do relatively regularly set up new police forces where there weren't police forces before. It's a different context, and they will tend to be much smaller than the police force you would in the Indian context, but it does happen, and it's successful. It's what's to function, so it just doesn't work.
Absolutely, and you could even change it incrementally, I believe, if you had the kind of leadership you need in the states going all the way down to the districts. Because if you take your public, your local public, into the policing, as they do in the United States, why does it succeed? Because it has the community's sanction. It's policing by consent. To a certain extent, you did it in Northern Ireland. If you think about it, so many years of anger, resentment, polarization, and then you have the Good Friday Agreement, you have Patton, you have the community involved, and then in 5 years you change the attitude of the public and the police towards each other. It may have gone back, there may be mistakes, there may be all sorts of things, nothing is perfect. But there's at least an acknowledgement that you can't go on like this. And the acknowledgement, I think, comes from the power relationships. The Catholics, the Protestants, the police, the public, everybody was, the politicians, were kind of evenly balanced. Here, that even balance has not yet been brought up. But the speed at which there is political awareness growing, I don't think we can go on much more like this. But my fear is like Ms. Hoyle's fear, is that we go, rather than go towards progressive changes, because there is so much desperation and need for safety, people go the other way and want a tyrannical police that will just put everything right and forget about the rule of law and all of that.
Elizabeth the first, and then
Hi, thanks for those thoughts. I wondered what you thought the role of pressure groups were, and also NGOs in terms of raising awareness about the way in which the police are behaving. I mean, for example, the public response to the rapes was quite galvanising from what it seemed from afar, and I just wondered the lasting impact that groups like CHRI can have, for example, much more broadly. I think you talked about it a little bit in Ben's response, but if you could elaborate on that.
I think pressure groups are very important. And I think that pressure groups do have an effect. But sometimes that effect is so slow, so drop by drop, that you lose faith as a pressure group. And sometimes you hit upon something that, well, there are all sorts of dilemmas, Ms. Parma, there are all sorts of dilemmas. I was just thinking of two, three things. One is my comparison. I do two areas of work, which is access to information and access to justice. The access to information, it was like putting a small cigarette out on a tinderbox. It just went. Everybody got excited about it. The community got excited about it. We found a methodology that worked. We found a methodology that could be replicated. As soon as the law was passed, we trained people, we oriented people, and somehow thousands of people, and not only myself, I mean lots of other people, thousands of people just got interested in it. And now it's become so embedded that it's difficult to roll back. We may yet roll it back, but this battle and pressure group plays a big part. In terms of policing, people know, there is not a single meeting that I have not been to where people don't spend, if it's a one-day meeting, you have to leave the morning for venting. No matter which way you organize the discussion, whether it's professors or whether it's really poor people, they just vent. How much they hate the police, how much they can't bear it, how they can't go to justice, everything. Then beyond that, when we leave there, it's very hard to get the group to work on the ground because there is so much danger in taking on the police. So we are now at the stage of building awareness about what is wrong with the police. Everybody knows. How to mend it, that conversation is just beginning. How to compromise on the mending, what we have to give and take, the negotiation. Many people look at CHRI and say, you people are in the pockets of the police. The police say, you human rights people are useless. What the hell is human rights? You come and see what we have to do on the ground. You people have no clue, you just sit in air-conditioned rooms. That's one phrase that I will take to my grave with me, and I hope my grave is air-conditioned. Yes. You people who sit in air-conditioned rooms simply have no idea what we have to go through. When I'm faced with a terrorist, why should I think about his human rights? What about my human rights? And so on and so forth. I mean, these are just set phrases. I'm going to make a Facebook of it one of these days.
it will be a bestseller. Thank you, Professor Rao, and then I think
In the context of privatization of justice, where we have seen arbitration has emerged as an important form of dispute resolution. context in relation to the public justice system which was existing. So that's a trend of the day. Similarly, yesterday we had an interesting presentation by Professor Jan Loder speaking about private security system, increasing trend. And the UK has already moved towards the privatization of prisons. So Maya, how do you look at this? Because we also have some of these proponents in India who are advocating for privatization of police, privatization of prisons. Do you think whether that would bring humane policing system or it will have its own problems and complexities further in the problems existing?
Krishna, I don't know enough about it. As an academic, you all have probably studied it for years. I don't know enough about it, but just as an impressionistic thing, where you don't have systems of strong accountability, I don't think anything works, whether it's private or whether it's public. It just doesn't work. In the end, and if you think that you can plant this beautiful rose bush in the middle of Kikar, I don't think you're going to get anywhere. You will have enclaves of excellence. You will have, come and meet my security guard. In the daytime he's doing computers, in the night time he's sleeping, and the poor fellow is 14 years old from Bihar. You know, all he talks to me about is how is he get into an English class. There's no systems of accountability. There's no standards. There's not even, Krishna, you're talking about private security and private policing. You kindly tell me what is the protocol for when you pull your gun and if you are a policeman. There's no licensing system. There's no reporting and protocol. There is in the guidelines, but nobody, not the leadership, has heard about it. They think that it is their God-given right to have a gun and pull it out and shoot you just because you're a policeman. You know it. So privatization, what the heck? You are privatized. You are privatized to the local mafia and to the local politician that you have today. You don't think you're a public service, please.
I think we could squeeze one more in if it's a quick one. Yeah?
I think your idea of a fresh start is very fascinating. But you must understand the context. We had a fresh start separation between police and prosecution. 1973. 41 years it has taken. And there is no clear separation. In most of the states, prosecution is from the police department. They have the same. In normative system, you have separation. You have separation between judiciary and these branches, agencies. And at the functional level, often the Supreme Court is giving 16 directions, guidelines, how to facilitate encounters. Now, this is the reality. The reality is that you start with a fresh start, but things will come back to the same. Ultimately, the real hope in our society is compliance with the rule of law. For next 30, 40 years, strict compliance with rule of law. And rule of law has got to be reformed, has to be made in tune with people's aspiration. Where does the problem come? Policing and politics are very closely intertwined. It is the power of the police that politician wants to use. And why Prakash Singh lies unused, unimplemented, why all that, the answer is that, and we are not taking on the politics straight away. We have got to empirically understand the linkages between politics and police. This is an area in which, in UK also, powers that be, when Green in his article, essay in Oxford Handbook of Criminology, has brought this point out very well, when he says that there is a very close relationship between power and politics, and state is at the top of the power structure. You see Katrina cases coming from Gujarat only. You see Akshardham case. And why the judiciary doesn't make police accountable? Says that these people have been locked up. The 3 people have faced death row and ultimately acquits them, but doesn't say a word about police accountability. Court also knows that we are part of a state in which all this is shadow boxing and happening. Therefore, we have got to take politics on board unless we critically analyze politics and relationship in the context of relationship with police. We cannot think of a fresh start. In some form or the other, it will again, new avatar will come, and this new avatar may be even ghastlier. Whether it is a private policing, whether it is a privatized public policing, new avatar will be more deadly. That is what mosquito entomologists say, that new avatar will be more deadly. Therefore, we have got to be very cautious on this idea of fresh start.
I don't want to take more time. I just want to make one quick remark. You're quite right, of course, in all you say, Dr. Pandit. The only thing I would say about Prakash Singh, this famous case where they gave 6 judgments, 6 directions. Prakash Singh is not a dead letter. I mean, if I woke up in the morning and thought Prakash Singh is a dead letter, what would we do? We would have to disband and go away. No, Prakash Singh is not a dead letter. Prakash Singh has cast the stone into a still pond. And that is the hook through which we will debate, we will discuss. It may not happen, but we will go someplace where we were going no place before.